us is how do we come together as a united people working for the same goal: better, safer, happier communities and country. The panel tonight is our answer to how we might start that question, that conversation. The executive committee of the PRC chose these panelists because we thought their particular backgrounds and areas of expertise would provide viewpoints that are inclusive of a wide range of people. They are not going to lay out and defend their particular political and cultural viewpoints. They will speak from their professional and personal backgrounds to suggest common values and approaches to serve as a foundation to move forward towards our shared goal. I will introduce each speaker before they speak rather than all at once. They each have impressive backgrounds that deserve to be singled out. After the presentations, the panelists will have a few minutes to comment on each other's remarks or to ask questions, and then we'll open it to questions from you, the audience. Sudha Ratan is a professor of political science in the Department of Social Sciences at Augusta University. She currently teaches in the undergraduate political science program, as well as the graduate intelligence and security studies program. She served since 2013 as a consultant on the AFPAC region, doing workshops for Just Track interagency training through the Rule of Law Consortium at the University of South Carolina. From 2010 to 14, she was a consultant for the International and Operational Law Division Office of the Judge Advocate General, the U.S. Army at the Pentagon. Her current research focuses on interstate challenges of managing cybersecurity. And so, Sudha, go ahead for your presentation, please.
All right, thank you, Andy. Thank you for having me tonight. So Andy asked me to talk a little bit about kind of the background to this election. And I thought I'd begin by taking a look at, one of the biggest concerns coming out of this election that I've heard over and over again from people is what they see as the fundamental divide that seems to have erupted in this country. And a lot of people who have been very stressed out and upset about the fact that more than 10 million more people voted for President Trump this time around than they did in 2016. So there are real concerns being expressed among voters about the divided nature of the political landscape in the United States. So I want to just begin by saying that this is something that is not new in our history. And you can go back to other very close elections. In fact, these elections don't seem as close if you look at the history of past elections in the United States. And in 1824, in the 1820s, you had a couple of elections that were very, very close. One in particular, the election in 1824, which was between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, where it went to the House of Representatives, and Adams won that vote won that election by one vote. But that vote was very problematic because it was a result of backroom dealings, which gave the election to Adams and resulted in a very irate Jackson and his followers essentially splitting from the Democratic Republican Party and creating the Democratic Party for the 1828 elections, which he then won. And it just revealed this fundamental divide between people who had very different visions of what government should be about, and especially the role of the newly formed federal government. You come to the end of the century and you have the election of 1876. This is post-Civil War. And you have the election of Rutherford Hayes, who really, again, that was one of the longest election cycles in the US, because the election was not decided until March the following year. And again, it went to the House of Representatives. And in that case, he won by one vote, but even more problematic was that he had lost the popular vote by a significant margin to the Democratic candidate. And again, that was that election represented this divide that had arisen in this country as a consequence of the Civil War, because Hayes was brought to office on the promise that federal troops would be removed from the southern states in the post-Civil War period. And it really kind of ended the period of Reconstruction. So, when we talk about our elections, to me, it doesn't appear to be anywhere close to the kinds of tensions that you see in the body politic of the United States in the early 19th and again in the late 19th century. You fast forward to the 20th century and you had the election of John F. Kennedy. The Kennedy-Nixon election was very closely fought, and he won the popular vote by a margin of less than 120,000. So once again, very divided in 1960. And of course, as Andy mentioned, in the last few election cycles, we've again seen very closely fought elections with Bush versus Gore being decided by the Supreme Court. And then 2016 with Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote, losing the Electoral College. And now you've got the Trump vote, which was actually, when you look at the actual votes cast, it's pretty amazing to see how evenly split the country really is. And I just want to kind of contrast the 19th century with the 20th and the 21st, because what I see as very interesting about the closely fought elections that we're contending with right now is the elections of the 19th century that were closely fought really represented internal dynamics within the United States. The country was shaking out over very big issues. In the early part of the 20th century, early part of the 19th century, it was about the nature of government. What kind of government did the United States want? There were those who favored states' rights, those who favored a stronger federal government. You come to the end of the 19th century and it's really post-Civil War. It's newly industrializing, a country that's newly industrializing. There are social economic issues that are playing out in these elections. But the recent elections to me represent a break with that, because what you're seeing is the closely fought nature of these elections represents a country that is dealing with globalization, because the forces that are at work within the United States, especially the socio-economic inequities that have resulted in large numbers of people feeling disaffected, very untrusting of government, are really the result of larger forces outside of the United States. We're talking about a global economic network, which is, torn apart the economic safety net that has always existed for Americans. And American workers have been pulled out of the workforce because of forces outside of the US. And these elections that we're seeing now really represent, I think, the stresses on a political system that was not set up to deal with a globalized United States. The political system that we have worked fine as long as we were not part of this larger global economic system, but it's not weathering well as we are dragged into these larger cycles of boom, bust, economic recessions. These are things that we don't control as much. So I think that's one thing that kind of sets these electoral cycles apart from those that have gone before. The other thing I want to just mention is that I think in addition to globalization, globalization is socioeconomic and it's political. We in the United States are also feeling the pressures that other countries have actually felt before us in terms of the social changes that are going on worldwide, because we talk about Trump as being a nationalistic leader, while other countries have predated, have walked the path of political nationalism ahead of us in election cycles in recent years. Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India was elected in 2014 on a clearly nationalist platform. And even prior to that, Prime Minister Erdogan in Turkey was very much a nationalist who then became a president. He's been in office since 2003. I think he and Putin are rivals for the longest tenure in office, right? And so we have these nationalistic forces around the world, and we are no different than other countries in that we've thrown up our own nationalist for what it's worth. The second thing that I want to mention about these elections very quickly is that I think our close elections are also obviously a byproduct of a political system and an electoral process that has practically encouraged this, because we've had gerrymandering across the country. And what we are seeing is the disconnect between who gets elected into office and how the people vote, the popular vote goes. And a lot of that has to do with redistricting after a census. A classic example of this is Pennsylvania, which after the 2010 census redistricted, redrew the districts. And from 2011 on, out of the 18 districts in Pennsylvania, 13 went to Republicans. And it was such a glaring anomaly that finally in 2018, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ordered the state to redistrict, and they did. And in the last 2 election cycles, we have seen Pennsylvania, the districts fall the way the popular vote falls, because Pennsylvania is a purple state. Half the people vote Republican, half the people vote Democratic. And now in the last 2 election cycles in 2018 and 2020, we've seen 9 districts, congressional districts, go to the Republicans and 9 go to the Democrats, which is how it should be. But unfortunately, that is not true of all of our states. So we have an electoral process that is flawed. And then secondly, the other aspect of the electoral process is that we have a deeply undemocratic Senate. Today, when you look at the Senate, you have a situation where we have 45 Democrats and 2 independents who caucus with the Democrats, and they represent about 169 million voters. And you have 50, do the math, I think it's 53 Republican senators who represent 158 million voters. So there's about approximately a 14 million voter difference in the Senate. So it is definitely not one person, one vote. So we have got electoral issues that complicate the matter. And the result is a Congress that is really unrepresentative of what people want. And so when we talk about the 3 branches of American government, and I've said this to my students periodically, when we complain about the rise of presidents like Trump, it's important to understand that we have a failed Congress, a Congress that has not done its job. And as a result of which, people have lost faith in government. There's a real sense that government doesn't work for people, and that lots of people are being left out in the cold and their problems are not being addressed. And this is across the board, Republican and Democrat, because as pollsters have pointed out, some of the people who voted for Obama voted for Trump. So there's a lot of overlap there between some of these disaffected contingents of voters. And that's something to think about, I think, when we think about common ground. Obviously, there is common ground there. It's a question of making it work. And then lastly, I just want to point out that the other complicating factor for us here is the fragmentation of the social media landscape. Today, we live in a world with Facebook and Twitter, where people can selectively choose to hear the news that they want to hear, read what they want to hear, and so it's read what they want to read. And so the result is finding common ground, which is what we're all about, has become increasingly difficult because of social media. And how we, if anybody could figure a way out of that, I think you'd probably win a Nobel Peace Prize. So I don't have an easy answer for that. I do want to say that I think there are lots of places that we could begin to have conversations at the individual and the local level, because it is not that we need to get over being divided. I think being divided is not necessarily a bad thing. Being bitterly divided is a very bad thing. And that's where we are at right now. So I think conversations like the one we're having, individual conversations that we can have with people, those are ways of building those small bridges. Because as a political scientist, I'm deeply pessimistic about the ability to bring institutional change. The kinds of things I've mentioned about electoral changes, those are not going to happen, because the only party that would be interested in making those changes right now is the Democratic Party. And for that, you would need a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, which is not going to happen. Because we tend to, I think one of the things is when you have people who are so untrusting of government, we also have an American population that tends to send a split ticket. So people tend to vote split tickets. And we're seeing that even in this election where while President Trump might not have won, down ticket, a lot of Republicans won and a lot of Democrats won. So we're back to divided politics. All right, Andy, I'm going to stop this. I don't have a particularly cheery solution to this.
Well, I mean, but it's the background that we needed, and I appreciate it. I'm also working to try to get a link to those who are on, try to go to YouTube, but let me go ahead. Sid Gates is up next. Sid's a co-founder of a Augusta private psychotherapy practice. He's a full-time licensed marriage and family therapist. He's also an ordained Presbyterian PCUSA minister. He's a frequent presenter on topics interfacing the behavioral sciences and spirituality. His, quote, spiritual activism, close quote, often encompasses interfaith dimensions addressing issues of the common good. He is the interfaith coordinator for the Coalition for Mental Health, Mental and Spiritual Health Ministries of Augusta. So Sid, let you give us some background from your viewpoint and conflict resolution, which you do a lot of when marriage counseling, I suspect.
Well, first off, let me thank Dr. Andy Reese and the PRC for this invitation to be a part of this august panel. I want to thank the other panelists for taking their time out to be with us tonight, and also the listening audience, which I hope will be more than just a listening audience, but an interactive audience as we move through the program. I would like to begin my opening words tonight with a brief apocryphal story. So I'm going to ask us all to kind of suspend our spiritual views, persons of faith and no faith. This is classic dualism. This is God, devil. So here we go. Give me a little latitude. Martin Marty, great American religious scholar, calls this the parable of the procrastinator. So it seems that Satan has sent 3 minions down to earth to figure out how to conquer the earth. And so he's called them back and they're having their meeting. And the first one says, "Send me Satan, I will tell them there is no God." And Satan scowls and says, "Well, that's been tried before." Number 2 said, "Send me, I will tell them there is no sin." And again, the devil says, "That's been tried before too." The third one says, "Send me, I will tell them there is no hurry." Hearing this, the devil smiled and nodded his approval. Now, I'm going to posit, I think there is a quantum difference and contrast between a chicken little, the sky is falling attitude, the earth is, and all of its inhabitants are going to hell in a handbasket, that we can all get sucked into rather easily. There's a contrast between that, I believe, and a prudent, let's read the signs correctly and form balanced corrective measures. But make no mistake, we are talking about whether lingering old concerns or newly emerging issues, real crises confronting inhabitants of this planet. Perhaps many of us refer to this as challenges. Maybe we want to reframe it a little bit, but nonetheless, these are grave situations. These are real impactful and potentially nation and world destroying challenges. The pandemic has once again held up to humanity, the interconnectedness of human life and its fragility. Nuclear arms proliferation are back on the radar screen, and not just a Cold War history factoid anymore. Iran, North Korea, and our own blustery boast and flexing a muscle in this direction has had international response as well. Clearly, a consensus believes in environmental change, whether we call it climate change or global warming, all the UN studies, over 2,000. Anecdotally, gee, why is it so warm in Chicago in January? These have been sounded for decades. And I want to come back to this eco-justice piece in just a minute here, when I'm going to be a little bit solution focused to end my comments up front here. Racial divides, economic divides, that's what we're talking about tonight, healing divides, reproductive divides, orientation divides, gun control divides, and a whole host of other divides could be addressed well into the night tonight. And we would be just scratching the surface. Divides, as Dr. Rattan was saying, have always been with us and they will remain with us. Now, I'm not normalizing all divides here and saying that they are equal. Living in New York and being a Yankees fan or a Mets fan probably doesn't threaten to take out most of life as we know it, like some of the other divides can. But differences of opinion and understanding does not have to be a bad thing. It does not. A significant problem, as I see it, is that so often the competing sides want unanimity. You have to believe just like us and not them, versus consensus. Consensus on a matter can drive productive change. Consensus could save the planet. And change is the way of the universe. In fact, it's been said the only constant in the universe is change. George Bernard Shaw reminds us progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. In the psychotherapy world, we call this premature closure, arresting thought development, and I think it's a colossal threat to a person's development, a relationship development, religious, spiritual development, and a threat to democracy. Any attempt to close a discussion on common good issues puts our democracy in peril. But the various seats of power, change is often viewed as a threat. We've always done it this way, or why can't they be happy the way things are? Or we have it pretty good in this country. No, you have it pretty good or damn good. And often they, you, me, and all of us can dismiss a change movement because we can't relate or don't want to relate. John Kennedy once opined, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. And he's echoing, of course, Jefferson. MLK, Dr. King adds, let nobody fool you. All the loud noises we hear today are nothing but the death groans of the dying system. And I would agree that a system that does not work for the majority of its citizens needs to change, be altered, replaced. A famous Princeton study, gotta love those Presbyterians, a couple of years ago, validated that we are officially an oligarchy now, top-down government dictated by power elites. That doesn't usually turn out well in the annals of human history. So protests have always in one form or another been a galvanizing force in changing societies, not always for the better, but often the linchpin for needed systemic benefit. Lincoln famously stated, to sin by silence when they should protest makes cowards of human beings. We'll perhaps have more discussion tonight in this direction of protest, but to summarize, as JFK informs, if there is oppression with conventional means not leading to resolving of issues, civil unrest follows. Lincoln, King, and others did and do champion the cause, many of us, of protest. And yes, they would not advocate violent lawlessness or abolishing dialogue for resolution purposes between factions. Neither do I. In my work as a marriage and family therapist, and I appreciate Dr. Reese pointing that out, I like to reframe anger. I know a lot of us have been scared by some of the angry responses in society the last year or so, but I would remind us, and I do in therapy, that anger means you give a darn. Anger means you care about something. I would rather have anger than apathy. In fact, Aristotle once said, anyone who doesn't get mad at the right person at the right time for the right reason is a fool. And I like to chide one of my Roman Catholic priest friends. Yes, anger is one of the 7 deadlies, and yet St. Augustine had the great position. Hope, H-O-P-E, has 2 beautiful daughters. Their names are Anger and Courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. So anger can be galvanizing. Anger can fuel. Anger can clarify. I use externalization a lot in my work, which is a way of perhaps not pointing a finger at somebody, but let's say a parent's an alcoholic. So we talk about the family battling alcoholism. What can we all do to face this situation versus victimizing somebody and pointing a finger? It's a way to try to unify against a certain reality. I want to close by talking about something I think is a wonderful solution-focused concept. I get this from Ralph Nader. He calls it convergence, which is real different from compromise. Compromise means usually we're giving up some beliefs or core convictions. But reality is the country has had some wonderful examples of convergence where divisive sides have come together. You think of 9/11, world wars, pandemics, natural disasters, and so forth. I want to quickly give an example of where I think convergence is happening in a unique way. I have the honor of collaborating with Mark Alberton. One of his new films is on the scientific and spiritual aspects of protecting the earth, eco-justice. It's one of the few places when you think about it, all the religions can agree. Let's don't make the seas toilets and belch anything into the air. I came across a woman in Atlanta, Debbie Dooley, who is a Tea Party former. She is uber conservative. She's wonderful in so many ways, but we're in a different political galaxy. And yet she has led a movement, which she calls the Green Tea Coalition, which has brought together the Sierra Club and the Christian Coalition to fight for rooftop energy, solar panels. Now, here's the thing. Her whole shtick and her whole MO is free enterprise. Those of us that believe in tree hugging and we love snail darters and spotted owls, which I do, we are excited about this kind of renewable energy because it will protect the environment. So again, she's driven more by free commerce, free trade, and yet we all benefit from it. So neither side has to compromise. She's still conservative. She is still going to believe in conservative values. I would believe in myself as more moderate to progressive, but this is a great example of convergence. Both sides adhering to their beliefs, but it having utility for a greater number. So I close with a quote by Cornel West. Cornel West was our keynote one year for our annual Martin Luther King tribute service entitled Why Dr. King Still Matters. And Cornel West once said the following, and I hold to this as well: I am in no way optimistic, but I remain a prisoner of hope. And these kind of events stoke the hope fires for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Sid. Next speaker is Scott Singer. He's a successful financial advisor with Janney Montgomery Scott, which he likes to say, give me opportunity to do well and good, close quote. He spent his entire career in financial services industry, starting with the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He served on the Aiken County Council from 2003 to 2014, and is a two-time past president of the Aiken Kiwanis Club. He's past chair of both the local and state American Red Cross, having received the Clara Barton Award in both roles, and served on the Resolutions Committee of the Board of Governors. He is currently the chair of the Aiken County Human Relations Council. So, Scott, if you'd like to go ahead and share with us your perspective.
Let me go ahead and remove the mute. Thank you, Andy, for inviting me to be a part of tonight's forum. I'm honored to have been asked to present alongside such knowledgeable and accomplished panelists. As Andy mentioned, I held political office for 12 years. And while I find public service to be extremely gratifying, I chose not to run for re-election back in 2014 so I could focus on raising my two boys and building my financial advisor practice. I figured once my kids were older and I was no longer coaching them in baseball or basketball or soccer, the world would still have sufficient problems if ever I decided to throw my hat back in the political ring. Frankly, I didn't think it would have this many problems or that the political chasm in our nation would be so deep and wide. But so, the sad and bitter truth is I'm a recovering politician. And as such, my friends and family would tell you that I'm rarely at a loss for words. However, much to my surprise, I found prepping for tonight's discussion a lot more difficult than I initially thought because I really wasn't sure where to begin. The issues we face today are complex, and there are no simple remedies to what ails our nation's troubles. But I guess, as Sud explained earlier, that's pretty much been the case since the founding of the Republic. To quote one of my favorite fictional characters, Andy Shepard, from the movie The American President, quote, "America isn't easy. America is advanced citizenship. You gotta want it bad because it's gonna put up a fight," unquote. Well, it's certainly putting up a fight right now, isn't it, Sarah? But maybe that's what we should expect as this nation undergoes a much needed course correction, in my opinion, as we move in fits and starts toward that more perfect union. So what, if anything, can we specifically do to bridge the gap or lessen the political polarization that seems to be tearing at the very fabric of our nation? I think a good place to start is making an effort to foster better, deeper, more effective communication, just like we're doing in tonight's forum. Obviously, telling people how stupid or wrong they are is a recipe for failure, no matter if it's true or how well you frame your argument. Unfortunately, that seems to be where we're at with much of our public discourse. Instead, as Stephen Covey explained in The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, if we truly want to change minds, we must first seek to understand rather than to be understood. Unfortunately, Twitter and Facebook are not conducive to deep discussion, and therefore, contrary to what many would like to believe, exposing others to ideas different than our own rarely cause them to change their viewpoint. In fact, depending on the audience, it might just have the opposite effect, as shown in a joint study that I found pretty fascinating that I read a couple of years ago, conducted by Brigham Young University and New York University. What the researchers did was survey a large sample of Democrats and Republicans who visit Twitter at least 3 times a week about a range of social policy issues. 1 week later, they randomly assigned respondents to a treatment condition in which they were offered financial incentives to follow a Twitter bot for 1 month that exposed them to messages from those with opposing views and ideologies. Respondents were then resurveyed at the end of the month to measure the effect of this treatment and at regular intervals throughout the study period to monitor treatment compliance. What they found is Republicans who followed a liberal Twitter bot became substantially more rather than less conservative post-treatment. Democrats, on the other hand, saw only marginal increase in liberal attitudes after following the conservative Twitter bot. So I thought it was really interesting how there was that distinction. So based on these findings, one could plausibly deduce that only a fool would spend his or her time arguing politics with strangers on Facebook and Twitter. Well, as my wife, kids, and even casual friends will surely attest, when it comes to social media, seldom do I take my own advice. But in my own defense, I made a decision, rightly or wrongly, that it was my duty as a community leader and a public official to speak out against caustic and outlandish behavior, which I saw as actually working to dismantle the institutions of our government that had truly made America great. Hopefully, though, I've done that more often than not using a civil tongue. Just as in other areas of life, the likelihood of a successful outcome in any given situation or negotiation is largely dependent upon the level of respect between the various parties or factions. Folks don't even have to like one another to get things done. I can tell you that's from my experience on council, although it helps, but they sure as heck better have at least a modicum of respect for one another. Otherwise, the relationship becomes purely transactional or worse, contemptuous, in which case cooperation and sustained progress become almost impossible. I say this because viewing your political opponents with contempt is completely antithetical to a functioning democracy. Once one feels contempt for the other guy, respect disappears almost as a matter of definition. One doesn't have to work or compromise with those one holds in contempt. One does not have to seek an overlapping consensus with their values, or wish to have one's kids associate with them, try to converse with them at a dinner party, or provide assistance to them when they're threatened or bullied. It doesn't even require them to object when they see that folks are being put in cages or even killed. Furthermore, contempt is not the sort of attitude that is easy to reverse. Anger, even resentment, can come and go, but once you are contemptuous of something or someone, it's hard to go back, which I believe is where we find ourselves today. But if you truly want to right our ship of state, we must begin to rebuild a foundation of respect. I assure you it can be done. I didn't walk away totally from public service when I stepped off council. I am currently the chair of the Aiken County Human Relations Commission, an advisory body that helps serve as the eyes and ears of council. A couple of years back, we held listening tours throughout the county, one of the purposes of which was to examine issues facing our citizenry from their perspective, and to do so in a non-politically charged atmosphere. As an advisory-only panel, we hold no statutory authority and thus could not directly solve anyone's problems, a fact we made abundantly clear at the start of every meeting. Nevertheless, folks were more than eager to share their concerns, challenges, and yes, complaints about local government. Our first and most important ground rule was all in attendance were expected to treat one another with courtesy and respect. And if you didn't do it, we were asked to leave. And while we covered some really hot button topics, in the realm of law enforcement and education. With few exceptions, everyone adhered to the rule. It was gratifying to see folks with such disparate backgrounds and ideas come together to focus on common issues. I am convinced that part of the reason the level of discourse was so reverent is that members of the public honestly believed and felt that we listened to them as committee members and that we valued their input, even if we couldn't promise to fix their problem or issue. But guess what? But precisely because we were able to foster an atmosphere of mutual respect and cooperation, we were able to build consensus on a host of issues and then turn those findings over to the actual official authority stakeholders, such as council itself, the school board, and the sheriff's department, who in turn use the information to affect meaningful change. And I could give you a lot of examples, but one in particular that came out of an outcome was we ultimately decided, and council agreed, that we weren't doing as good a job fixing roads. And as I think Andy mentioned in our pre-meeting, folks that have a pothole in front of their house are less concerned with a Republican or Democrat if you just get it done, right? So in this particular case, we realized that our service delivery was being hampered based on the input that we were receiving. We basically added a road crew and actually changed how we went about, or council went about, determining priority of problems. And so again, citizenry was better served because people were allowed to talk and vent and express their thoughts without fear of reprisal or retribution. So I guess if I was going to sum up my remarks in a single line, I'd say as humans, we all have the need to be heard before we will listen.
Thank you. Finally, our last speaker is Dante Stewart. He's a writer and speaker whose voice has been featured on CNN, Washington Post, Christianity Today, Sojourners, The Witness, the Black Christian Collective, Comment Magazine, and many others. As an up-and-coming voice, he writes and speaks into the areas of race, religion, and politics. He's currently studying at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, and he's also on the staff at Tabernacle Baptist Church here in Augusta, a historically very important church here and nationwide, actually. So Dante, you're on.
So great to be with many of you tonight. I'm so grateful to be able to be in the space and to reflect deeply on this moment of 2020 and really trying to wrestle deeply with questions of, democracy, questions of faith, and questions of character and morality, questions of what bodies we value, even questions of what it means to be American. And what does it mean to be, quote unquote, we the people? And what is these various kind of words that we've been so inundated with mean for us? What kind of story it is inviting us into, and what kind of meaning is it generating for us? I want to start particularly with a quote from the great essayist James Baldwin. Baldwin and I forgot what year he wrote this particular book in. I think it was the mid 60s. He wrote a book entitled "Nobody Knows My Name." Many people would know James Baldwin from the the recent documentary "I Am Not Your Negro," or through the great Princeton scholar Eddie Glaude, who wrote an incredible book entitled "Begin Again." James Baldwin's America and Our Own. Baldwin in this book, toward the end of chapter 1, which is entitled "What Does It Mean to Be American?" And when he found out what does it mean to be American, at the end of that chapter, he wrote that it is not our statesmen who is our strongest arm in shaping a new world, but it is our writers. And for me, as a writer, I'm always wrestling with what is the responsibility of the writer, particularly what is the responsibility of the Black writer? What is the responsibility of me as a Black Christian male millennial at each one of those intersections, trying to generate some type of meaning given this moment that we find ourselves in. And I think, you know, as we think about this moment, honestly, I don't know about y'all, but I don't know where to start, if I'm being honest. If I'm just being honest about 2020, you know, there have been so many, you know, experiences of terror and trauma that we have been collectively forced into, that this is the country, as Dr. Rattan would say, that has in some sense been chosen for us. We're walking into a story of a system that is fundamentally broken. We're walking now, as Dr. Sid would know from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who would say that we are dealing with this kind of collective grief. We're working through the stages of grief right now, where some of us are in denial, some of us are in depression, some of us are angry, some of us are bargaining with the system, bargaining with ourselves, bargaining with one another, and some of us have accepted it and trying to make some type of meaning and identity and purpose. I want to particularly focus my time, you know, really wrestling, you know, as particularly in those intersections of the Black male Christian young millennial. You know, as I think about the lives, and I want to talk about young people particularly, but I want to talk as, you know, a young Black Christian male. When I think about the lives of young people emerging in this moment today, you know, our lives are becoming complex more and more. Many of you either have, some of you may have children my age. I'm 28 years old. Many of you have students and you interact with young people. And just in the last year, many of us have been forced to ask questions that we never would have thought that we would have asked and been forced to ask, and nor did our parents or our teachers imagine for us. And in some sense, the places that either are social or communal or sacred spaces for us that have given us much meaning are not oftentimes equipped to handle the particular complexities of human life and nuances that we're walking into every single day. Questions of identity, questions of purpose, sexuality, religion, white supremacy, racism, social media, and even the ongoing struggle of dealing with one's own trauma as a human person and the complexity of what those identities means, makes this moment of 2020 an exciting one, true, but also a very depressing and complexing one as well. And I was recently reading an incredible essay from Elizabeth Alexander, and she was writing in the New Yorker and entitled this essay, The Trayvon Generation, where she paints a picture for many of the emerging adults that are growing up in the last 25 years. We have experienced what many have believed to be moments of progress, whether one would deem that be economic progress or racial progress or social progress or technological progress. We are the babies of this generation of, you know, on the one hand, being baptized in messages of American exceptionalism, but also on the other hand, understanding the existential experience of the terrible ways we've learned how to be Americans. On the one hand, we have experienced greater access to opportunities, but we've also experienced greater access to public kind of executions and murders and of Black people, of gay people, trans people. On the one hand, we have experienced, you know, the promise of democracy and the promise of a better religion and a better faith, but also following every moment of progress that was imagined for us, as would be in the reconstruction of the civil rights movement. Every moment of progress and imagined equality is followed by a particular type of backlash that I think Dr. Rattan was getting at. You know, this backlash that we talk about in this moment is not both sides. So I don't narrate the story of American democracy and the faulting nature and the fragile nature of our social experiment as being this kind of identity of, both sides have equal problems that we just need to get together and come and kumbaya, figure it out. Well, nah, I mean, there is a particular cohort of Americans that's fundamentally committed to a certain type of America, as I think the brother actually is conservative, E.J. Dionne. He wrote an incredible book not too long ago, Why the White Went Wrong, and he talks about how this particular subset of Americans want the kind of racial, economic, political, and social reality that did not allow for Black people, gay people, women to embody what we would deem to be American democracy. The great poet June Jordan would say, hey, we the people, we're not always the people. America was not intended to be a free country from its inception. If there is anything exceptional about our country, it is the exceptional ways we have learned how to be terrible. It is the exceptional ways that we have learned how to go back on the promises of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The exceptional ways in which we have reneged on the promises that were in the kind of brilliant and ugly broken creed at the beginning of our country. But also, it is the exceptional ways in which the oppressed of our country have not believed that they were what those who were in power, particularly in white power, believed ourselves to be. But we took whatever raw elements that we had in our culture, in our religion, in our society, and we made something of it. As Ta-Nehisi Coates would say, white people made us a race, but we made ourselves a people. And there's been a constant American story at work here, two stories, at work within one another. It is a story of those who are committed to freedom, love, justice, and democracy. And it's a story of those who are not committed to the ideal of we the people. As we are existing right now in this moment of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, there's the possibility of us, actually imagining something better for ourselves. But we must remember that, as this identity, this American identity of resilience and hope and possibility of change is a meaningful story in our collective identity, there's also, the more powerful story, if we're honest, of a certain type of white rage and white backlash that does not desire the country to be more free, more loving, more just, and more equal, but desires the country to be more white, and in this case, in this nation, in this moment, more sick, less free, and more vulnerable to the fault lines that already exist for us. And so I think, Alexander in that essay, she wrote something very important. She says that many young people, particularly young Black people, as we experience these public events of racial terror, and as we experience, food insecurity, and as we experience, life being different, as we experience the hopelessness of American undemocratic ways of being together, these stories, these meaningful stories, these myths of our country that we are so trained in, they instruct us about our embodiment and our vulnerability. And I think as we think about the story of ourselves together, and the story, if we are to have a story of unity or whatnot, or whatever we want to call it, they have to begin with stories of embodiment and vulnerability. To think theologically for one moment, to be an embodied self is to be a person who is caught up in this drama much larger than yourself. To be an embodied self is to be caught up in human history and stories that you did not choose for yourself, but stories you have to make sense of. But to also be vulnerable is to also call into question the ways in which our systems and our life together and the social constructions and the kind of social, political, racial, and even religious architecture that we live and breathe in are oftentimes suffocating us. And to say that I can't breathe, It's not just a cry for the ways in which Black bodies are vulnerable in our society, but it is also a public outcry for the ways in which our society has learned how to devalue bodies that are non-white, non-poor, non-rich, non-male, non-access to power. And so we have to understand that, this story together means that, we have to find ways to tell better stories. Now, to think theologically again, I think that way is learning how to be healers. If I think about, Jesus as a paradigm, a meaningful paradigm for myself, or whatnot, and I think a meaningful paradigm, for all of us as we try and generate forms of life together. I stand in the world, as a Christian, not trying to create a Christian nation, but trying to generate forms of life together with other people that's meaningful, that's life-giving, that's more loving, that's more just, that's more inclusive. I believe that we all collectively should try to be healers in our society. We should try to be liberators. We should try to be community builders, and we should try to be better storytellers. Because in this moment, I believe with Baldwin, that we are at a crucial moment in our history. There is the possibility of failure. I believe that the myth of our country is that Americans can always bounce back from everything. Well, if you're white in this country, that story may be meaningful for you. If you have access to power in this country, that story may be meaningful to you. But if you're vulnerable and your body experience in this country is a continued experience of social suffering, having your body devalued, having your life diminished, then we have to say there's always the possibility of the country failing you. So we have to be honest about that. But there's also the possibility of us telling a better story. And I think that would be through trying to become healers, trying to become liberators, calling into question social, racial, political, economic, religious configurations, trying to be community builders, generating forms of life together with people who are different than us, so we can be serious listeners, understanders, and try and be better storytellers. Because in the end, 10, 20, 15, 10, 20, 30 years down the road, we want to be the ones that people remember in the history books that was on the right side of history, not being those who were lessons that we should learn from about the failures of our country. And I think that that's possible for all of us. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dante. Dante's going to have to leave us shortly because he's got another video meeting, Zoom meeting, actually in California, I think. Do any of you have a quick question or comment on what he's on his comment on his presentation before he leaves?
Dante, I just want to say thank you for what you said, because I think you're absolutely on point. I love your sweatshirt, by the way, Revolution. I think one of the things that's come out, kind of going to your point about the importance of social movements, I think, we see a difference even in the kind of response to the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. I think it lit a fuse across some of those cultural divides in this country. It brought people out who in earlier cases had not, I think, joined these protests. And, I think the significant thing is here, this happened during a time of the pandemic. So people put on face masks and walked out to show their anger at what was obviously a failing system, and a system that has failed so many people. So I think that's an important reminder that we can build those bridges. And I think it's really, it's going to be in the hands of you young people it's the generations coming up. I look at some of the systemic things that, that concern me. And I think when you look at, the systemic issues in the United States, maybe some of that will get fixed as your generation begins to take power and kind of, make those political changes systemically that need to happen. So thank you for those comments.
Dante, quickly, Sid here, the faith perspective, you mentioned that a good bit in your oration. And it's just really sad to me if we understand the word religion. It comes from the Latin religare, which means to bind together. And yet that's one of the most divisive realities in the world. I think there's tremendous, William Sloane Coffin, so many have talked about the interfaith coalescing. That's why I'm so proud of this PRC here. But I'm thinking of one example, over 400 faith institutions have divested from fossil fuel companies. This idea, once again, of convergence. Over 400, that's the largest block of any kind of entity. So again, even though we all know, whether it's Middle East or Ireland or wherever, religion has often had a face of hatred and dichotomism and what have you, religion can bind together. And that was a charge from the get-go.
Comment. One of the things that I think that just occurred to me as Sudha was speaking, the violence against Floyd and Taylor and so many of the others. What I see is it made us listen to each other's stories.
Mhm.
Okay, and Dante has had to check out. So, okay, questions, comments by the other panelists?
Yeah, I really liked your just latest comment, Andy. You know, there are these seminal moments that cause people to view things differently than maybe they viewed things before. I'm sorry that Dante had to leave. I was going to share with him a thought. You know, my dad used to say, Scott, where you stand is where you sit. And that was something that I've taken my entire life, because, you know, if you're in a certain socio-economic place, you're not necessarily going to relate, right, to folks that are not in that same place, unless you have some shared experience that comes up, or you have meaningful, important, deep discussions. Because when folks are having disagreements, rarely is it the actual disagreement they talk about that's the cause of the conflict. Sometimes you have to go to see the disagreement below the disagreement, and then sometimes the disagreement below the disagreement below the disagreement, to see that it's coming back to values and perceptions, and not necessarily a particular issue at hand. So again, to the extent that we can facilitate a good, deep, thought-provoking conversation, you know, it's a start. And it's a shame that we have to have the strife and then what we've seen, you know, to begin the dialogue, to begin the change. But I guess that's always how it's been.
Other comments or questions from the panelists? Sid?
Sudha, you mentioned Rutherford B. Hayes earlier, and Hayes had the great quote too, that we're no longer a nation of the people, by the people, for the people, but of corporations, by corporations, for corporations.
Yep.
Notice in the 1800s, Lincoln had some similar comments too about munition production and folks becoming millionaires because of that for the Civil War. And yet, before we disparage capitalism totally, the thing I like about convergence, once again, you think about states where you've had some draconian things going on. We're not going to bake cakes for gay couples or whatever. And the corporations have been the ones to stand up and say, we're going to leave your state if you pass this legislation.
Right.
Or if it was passed, if you don't revoke it. So it is kind of interesting. I think there's wonderful precedent again in this direction of convergence for rather, again, dichotomous sides, dualistic kind of thought quite often to come together in ways that benefit both. And I just see that as so essential in moving forward, which is different from compromise. Compromise, again, is you're giving up something, you're falling on your own sword to a certain extent, but this is allowing folks to still have their ideology, their values, but find ways to intertwine that.
Right. And, you know, I agree that you can get to those points of convergence, Sid, but I think the concern that I have, and this is really because of my training as a social scientist and a political scientist, is that this country, and I've said this before, it's a continent-sized country with huge discrepancies, even in terms of geography and climatic challenges. What is a concern for the West Coast is not necessarily the same concern for the Southeast or the Northeast. There are huge differences across this country that if you're going to rely solely on those private actors, corporations, NGOs, people of goodwill, to arrive at those convergences, I think it's going to be too little too late. I think what you need in this country, most countries that are beginning to be successful at dealing with, with environmental issues have governmental input into that process in order to have some kind of nationwide agreement. You can't just rely on those, ad hoc convergences that happen. I think those are good starting places, but I don't think that's sufficient. That ship has sailed. We're looking at serious problems coming down the road. If not, it's such a joke. I mean, people talk about the 100-year flood or the 1,000-year flood. Well, those are happening every year, it seems like, right? I mean, so these are dramatic problems. And if you look at what has happened in California with the fires, right? If you're going to let the private sector deal with this on its own, it's not going to work. I don't have an easy answer to how this is going to happen in a country this size, but we know that smaller countries like the Europeans, Germany is a good example of that, where you've seen a country come together with capitalists, private capital combined with pressure from government through regulation and tax breaks, plus you've got individual buy-in, and you can come up with something. Or you take, I think it's the Dutch, who've got a fantastic deal between, they've created this triangular partnership between academic institutions, the government, and the private sector. So I think we have to start thinking outside this very narrow perspective that Americans have, that government is bad. The only thing that's going to work is for the private sector to deal with it. And I think at this stage, especially when it comes to things like the environment, that is grossly irresponsible. It's irresponsible, and ultimately individual Americans will pay the price, because when bad things happen, it happens to individuals. It doesn't happen to corporations or to governments, right? People die because of the kinds of choices we make about our political system. And so that's my concern. The convergence thing, especially on the environment, I think is, if it had happened 200 years ago, I would have said, go for it. At this point, counting on convergence, it's too little.
Let me jump in here if I might. I don't think it's an either or scenario. When I was on council, I used to have a saying, and that was, I didn't care who got rich when a decision was made. My barometer was whether or not it benefited our community. And so there are a lot of votes that I took that made people money, and I was perfectly okay with that. Conversely, there were a lot of votes that I took that cost people a lot of money. In particular, this is ancient history for a lot of folks, but we had a tax increment financing proposal back in the mid 2000s that would have basically put additional $50 million in some developers' pockets, but it clearly was not going to benefit the community. And I voted against that, and fortunately was able to rally sufficient support and community support behind me that ultimately failed. But I paid the political price down the road, because there are very, very powerful interests, even at the local level. And if you think they're not there, you're not paying attention. One thing I learned, and I was very involved in Republican politics. I served and worked on campaigns, from president on down to governor to the local sheriff. But I can tell you, when you look at the parties themselves are only interested in one thing and one thing only, and that is the accumulation of power.
Right.
Right. Now, does that make them bad and evil in of themselves? No, it just makes them immoral, and we need to understand that. One of the things that's really, really troubled me, is this situation now where we have our alternative facts world, and people are okay with that. That's fundamentally at the core of addressing our problems. We didn't really talk too much, none of the panelists really talked too much of that tonight. Maybe, Andy, that's a topic for a future discussion.
Could be.
But when I forget who said it, I guess maybe it was the senator from New York, Patrick Monahan, I think, said it. He said that everyone's entitled to their own opinion; they're not entitled to their own facts.
Right.
And
Monahan.
and right now, too many people
Yes.
don't want to hear facts. We can disagree again on real people can look at a set of facts and come up with different conclusions. But we should be able to at least agree on the facts. So, and again, I'm not I've been a Republican, my whole life, but I'm not a Trumpian Republican. You look at, from day one, the size of the inauguration crowd when the secretary or the press secretary, had to go out and basically say the crowds were larger than they were in 2008, when obviously you could look at the pictures and the video and know they weren't larger. But next, we all better fall in line with that type of thinking. And it's only snowballed since then. So, the solution to the problems that we face today ultimately has to incorporate, how do we address that? And again, I think a lot of it goes back to, communication, seeking common ground where things can get done, convergence. But this, and also understanding that, that while I'm a capitalist, my whole career in life is predicated on me being a capitalist. Unbridled capitalism is not ultimately going to get us where we need to be. There does have to be those, private-public partnerships and the consensus building over time that allows us to address the big picture. So.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that's important. Gregory, I think we had a question from online.
We have several, actually.
Okay.
Let's start with our attendees here. Henry says, "I'd like to hear how hear the panel speak on how do we balance economic, social justice, and selfishness."
Yeah, in 30 seconds, huh? Sid, do you want to take the first crack at that from the?
I want to make sure I heard the question. How do we balance social, economic inequality with what?
How do we balance economic, social justice, and selfishness?
Wow, man, that's got a dash of it all. That's got some spiritual, theological dynamics, as well as some human nature, behavioral science kind of aspects. Not the Bible thump here, but you think of the story of Jesus being tempted in the desert, and Satan tempts him with power and wealth. And I think that's we see that in politics. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, of course. I like Kennedy on this, a tide that rises all boats. And whether it's convergence or legislatures or what have you, we all do better economically. I think there's a spiritual principle here. When you look at the administrations that have done better economically for the hoi polloi, all of us, it's been because there's been that focus. And get back to Kennedy's line, if you're in a yacht, you're going to be higher anyway, but let the guy in the canoe feel better about himself. Henry Ford understood that too. Ford got it. Not everybody can afford a Lamborghini if they had Lamborghinis back then, but a Model T they could. So I think it's kind of a combination of synthesis of logic, wisdom. I think there's some moral, ethical aspects to that. But as Jim Wallace would remind us, Dante writes some for Sojourners. It's my favorite social justice religious magazine. But again, these are moral documents. A country's budget is a moral document when you think about it. where are we putting our money? We put more into our military, and this is not anti-military at all, than the next 15 nations combined. We have troops in 80 countries. So again, why they hate us and why are we having so much hate and strife in this country? And a lot of it does get back to misuse of power, and economics is certainly a part of that.
And I would just piggyback off of what Sid said and just say that I think, you know, if you want to tie in selfishness, individual selfishness, I'm assuming is what that question is about. You know, we all want, I think, the same kinds of things for our own families and ourselves: good health, educate our children, be safe physically, own our homes, however you want to define it. Those are selfish concerns. And I think it's important to recognize that you're only as safe as the weakest link in your society. So if you have great amounts of poverty, and the pandemic is a classic example of that. The reason we're all locked up in our homes, or we should be locked up in our homes, is because we have a whole bunch of people out there who won't wear masks and who are apparently running around spreading the stuff. You know, selfishness, concern for yourself is actually helped by improving the quality of life for other people, because it does keep you safe. It gives you a better country. All you have to do is compare the quality of life in a very poor, under-resourced country, which doesn't have the resources to invest in its own people, and compare that to a quote unquote more developed country where you have the ability to invest in your own people and take care of, you know, providing public transportation and police and, you know, homes, right, for your people. And people do better. And there's a reason why we have things like the quality of life index that rank countries based on this. And it is tied to selfishness. You know, ultimately it is about trying to make everybody's life better. You can't have that if you have huge discrepancies and inequities. And I think so that the two tie together. They're not at all they're not opposite to each other. I think they tie in together.
Yeah, you know, that question is one that has bedeviled evolution since Charles Darwin wrote his book. You know, how do you account for unselfishness when selfishness would seem to benefit the individual more? And of course, the thing is that we are a social species that flourishes within a group. We do not flourish on our own. And so it is that balance between what's good for the group and what's good for the individual. But what you were saying, Sudha, is that, yeah, when the group does better, we all do better.
Right. And I think Mother Nature is out to teach us all a lesson about why looking out for each other is probably the best thing for us to do.
Yeah.
If we won't learn it on our own, then I think there are forces larger than us that are in the process of teaching us that, right?
Yeah. I think one can make the case that over the past 500 years, one of the things that we have seen is a progressive enlargement of the circle of who is us versus who's them.
That is true.
So that when we are working for the common good, we're working for the common good of our group. But if our group is larger, then more people do better.
Yes.
And one of the things that's happening with globalization is it's become really clear that we're all in this together. And how do we operate such that everybody does better without some people feeling like that they have given up more than their share. Well, some people are probably going to have to give up more than their share, but they're still going to be better off than the rest of us. So, but it is that age-old quandary of doing good for ourselves and for everybody else. Gregory, do we have any more?
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on the comments thus far, because I saw it actually pop up on the screen at one of the folks listening or watching wrote a comment and they mentioned campaign finance reform. And it actually, what I wanted to briefly mention, we've always been a pluralistic society with competing interests. And I think it's naive and implausible to think that at some point, all those competing interests will have equal say-so. That's just not the way life in society works. But what's happened and led to some of our current problems, in my opinion, and it's been there in the past, as Suda mentioned, over different periods of time, is there are groups that have much more influence than they should, and they have much more influence because they control reins of power, because they have more access and influence. And a lot of that comes back to the whole issue of campaign finance reform. So, until we address that, we address gerrymandering that Suda talked about earlier, some of the systemic things, those folks will continue to have more influence. And one thing I disagreed a little bit, and he's not here to hear because I don't want to say something with him not being here. But Dante mentioned about that there's a large group of people who want to maintain the status quo and they want to subjugate others, and the term "want" implies intent. And there's no question that there's a subset of people that want that because they're the ones in power and authority, and they truly want to keep it. But I think they are in fact a minority. I think most of what you see is a manipulation on the part of those that have the power and the authority. And again, it's on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the aisle, and they manipulate. And because it's in their vested interest for us not to have those good, honest, deep conversations with one another. They'd rather keep us fighting with each other because that's how they maintain it. It's the divide and conquer strategy. Again, I'm not a fan of the president. The president has perfected that, right? And again, we there's some structural changes, some attitudinal changes that have to happen, and that we all need to work toward.
That's why the fairness doctrine was dismantled in '84.
That's right.
It used to be you could have your license if you were a radio or TV station yanked if you didn't report fair and balanced. Well, why would you not want to do that if ownership is mostly in a certain direction and is being self-protective? You don't want to have the other side represented. So that was really key. Now I know with the internet now, and that was never that's only radio and television, not print journalism. But I think that was an incredible statement in our country's history to do away with the fairness doctrine.
Good point.
So I see a question there, Gregory, that's asking about the division of the 1870s and what caused the division to dissipate. So I just want to say that that's really the era of industrialization in the US. So by the 1880s, 1890s, you've got these tensions between it's the era of big capital, Andrew Carnegie, right? It's the whole monopolization of American capitalism in the late 19th century. But in reaction to that, you had the rise of the progressives, and these were the people who were responsible for bringing about civil service reforms. They were anti-corruption, and all of that tension between those forces really continues into the early part of the 20th century and doesn't really go away. It's just kind of masked by the world wars. So the person asking the question asked, did it continue until World War I in the early 20th century? And it absolutely did. You have the roaring 20s, and then you had the crash of the stock market, which kind of drove the country into this massive depression. So what you see is that whole conflict between capital and labor comes out of that period, and it doesn't really go away.
Okay. We have others.
Yes, I have one on Facebook.
Okay.
Katie asked, may I ask what religions the panel members represent? Dante was Baptist, I believe, so I'll speak for him, but if everyone else wants to answer.
Sure, I was raised as a Hindu, and I don't really. I guess I'm a fallen Hindu, whatever that means.
Okay.
I'm Catholic. I'm Roman Catholic. I was born into a Roman Catholic family, raised Roman Catholic, and continue to that day. Continue to this day.
I'm Presbyterian, but the main line, we're very progressive. We've been ordaining women since the 50s. We were ahead of the Supreme Court with same-sex marriage. We're big on eco-justice. And I'm also one of the co-founders of the Progressive Religious Coalition. So I certainly believe in tolerance and interfaith dialogue. Again, we all do better when we all understand each other. Back to the point earlier, we need to listen. Thank you for that point, Scott.
Yeah. And I'm not a panelist, but I was raised as a Methodist, joined the Presbyterian Church USA for a few years because they were the ones in Cleveland that were doing the most interracial justice work. Moved to Augusta, couldn't find anybody that was doing that particularly, and became a church dropout for 17 years until I found Unitarian Universalism. But I also consider myself a religious humanist. I think we've covered a lot of the religious spectrum here.
I have one more question from our attendees. Frank asked, how do we get the message across that successful economic systems incorporate both capitalism and socialism?
Well, let me just say that as a professor, I'm always horrified at how little Americans actually understand capitalism and how few are actually aware of what Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations. They're very quick to refer to that, but they don't really understand that, the kind of capitalism that he envisioned actually did include safety nets for people who fell through the system, and that the kind of capitalism that the United States espouses is not pure capitalism, because we provide plenty of supports to a lot of people and to a lot of corporations. And we do a lot of handouts, except we hand it out to people who have access to power. And so I think, as an academic, I'm deeply troubled by the fact that I think Americans don't understand capitalism. And so they juxtapose these as kind of opposite values, capitalism versus socialism, when there's actually no country on the planet today that has either one perfectly. It's a mishmash of stuff. So I would just say that there is no pure capitalism.
Yeah, I agree. One of the problems, of course, is the alternative fact universe out
Yes.
there. But we have examples of countries who have successfully blended capitalism and the social safety net and taking care of everybody, who have better quality of life than we do.
Yes.
Overall. And if we can just use that as an example, capitalism is not going to go away.
And it shouldn't.
And it shouldn't go away. It has lifted more people out of poverty than any other thing ever. And yet we've also seen what happens when it's unchecked. So we need both.
Yes.
It is just after 9 o'clock, so I think we'll wrap this up. And let me end by saying there have been surveys, international surveys of people asking people what they value, what their highest values are. And the list includes things like you would expect: courage, generosity, wisdom. The number one value across all cultures, across different sexes, whatever, is integrity.
Andy, can we
Yes.
maybe all have a 30-second closing comment?
Works for me. Go for it.
Okay.
Sid.
All right. I've just got a need to weave Abraham Joshua Heschel into this. Heschel was a
Always
wonderful
for you.
rabbi, marched with King. William Sloane Coffin was good friends with him. But Heschel once said, and I quote, "In a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible." Some are guilty, but all are responsible. So again, democracy is not a spectator sport, and any way we can all be involved. This was hugely beneficial tonight, I think, for panelists and hopefully for others. Thank you, Andy, and the PRC for their according us this opportunity.
Yeah, and this is recorded, so we will, people that didn't get to see it because they had only the one way to access it will be able to find it. We'll send that out also. Scott, do you have a brief summary you want to make?
Well, I'd just like to again say thank you for allowing me to be a part. I enjoyed it immensely. I learned a lot. I learned from other panelists, and I learned by having to really synthesize and coalesce my own thoughts about what I wanted to say tonight. And I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Good.
And I will second that, Andy. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's always fun to do things with the PRC.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Gregory, you've been manipulating things sort of behind the scenes. Any comments that you'd like to make before we close this off?
Well, I think this has been tremendously beneficial. I appreciate all the panelists being here, and Dante too had to leave early. And on behalf of all of the people who joined us today, I've seen a lot of people say it was really good and they've enjoyed it, and they really appreciated all of your your viewpoints and thoughts tonight. So thank you on behalf of the community as a whole and the PRC. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. So we will close it down. We will get the information out about how people can see this. And I, for one, having been here and listened to you all, I want to go back and listen to it again. There were points that were made that I need to think about. So thank you all for joining us, and maybe we can do something similar on questions of common interest in the future, sponsored by the PRC. So good night all.
Good night.